This is Roger Green, host of the Surfing the MASH Tsunami podcast. Today, we're offering 5 conversations from episode 24, our discussion about looking back at EASL from 6 weeks after, plus a 5th discussion, which is a review of the question of the week from conversation 23. We've got Jeff McIntyre and Pharmanest CEO and founder Mathieu Pétichine for the interviews, and Mike Patel and Jose Willems for the discussion of the QOW. This conversation is with Jeff McIntyre, Vice President Liver Programs of Global Liver Institute and a frequent Surfing MASH guest. The first question had to do with Jeff's takeaways from the EASL Congress. He focuses on what he calls the overriding sense of optimism coming from the multiple pieces of positive drug data. He specifically cites data on Boehringer Ingelheim's survodutide, the follow-up work on Madrigal's resmetirom, and an anticipated presentation of semaglutide at the AASLD in November, along with strong FGF21 results as proof we are beginning to develop multiple robust, safe, and effective modes of action for drugs to treat at least pre-cirrhotic MASH and maybe even cirrhosis over time. His second point is that due to the drug trials and nomenclature change, GLI and other advocates are starting to have, as he puts it, more enlightened discussions about MASLD as an overall condition in the context of the whole patient and the related metabolic states. As a result, he comes to his third point, which is that multiple modes of action will teach us why what works in one patient might not in another, and ultimately reshape clinical trials so that the target might not be fibrosis, or at least not only fibrosis, but instead exactly how each drug works to prevent or regress fibrosis. Jeff envisions this line of inquiry as a big step down the pathway from requiring biopsy toward NITs. As we've discussed over the last several episodes, EASL Congress 2024 was really a seminal, empowering event for the MASH and MASLD community. Listening to these two dialogues with Matt Pétichine and Jeff McIntyre gives you a sense of the many different ways that players could look at this and the impact that it will have on their businesses or their not-for-profits going forward. It's an important set of issues and I think really intriguing. So just sit back, listen, learn, absorb, and when you're done, join the conversation in our LinkedIn discussion group. 2 simple questions, right? Question number 1 being, so what'd you take out of Milan? What were your takeaways? A, in general, and B, as they pertain to what you do.
Jeff McIntyre.
I think, the main thing I take away from EASL this past May or June, I guess it was, is that there's more of an overriding sense of optimism. And I think, we've had these pop-up moments where we've had readouts about various medications that have come out. And there's always been this sort of low-level buzz around trendy things like, AI, there's new technologies, maybe there's new technologies being applied to diagnostics. The optimism that I see is really resting on the foundation of the survodutide, on the Boehringer Ingelheim readout that Dr. Sanyal did. It really showed a strong response against fibrosis. And I think if the strength of its readout was quite amazing. But I think if you especially combine that with Madrigal's readout from last year and their approval process, you're beginning to see there's some optimism growing because there's been consistent good news. And I think folks are feeling optimistic about the Novo likely will have a readout at AASLD in San Diego this fall, this November. And so I think you're really beginning to feel more of a sense of, dare I say, grounded optimism. It isn't just kind of the, everything is awesome sort of Lego movie approach that it's all good, but you're actually beginning to see it backed up with these things that are substantive things that patients and the field and the industry can actually lean on to be able to take next steps.
Yeah, so, I get that. I get that totally. For reasons we may get into as we go through this conversation, I would probably add the efruxifermin late breaker to that and the pegozafermin data to suggest, which we'll get to why I say that specifically in a moment, but I think that adds to it, right? The platform of optimism. So it's interesting. One of the things we observed is when we did the preview episode for EASL, way back, feels like forever ago, but it was only May. One of the interesting conclusions that our entire panel came to, and this included Alexander Krag and Hannes Hagström and Jorn and Louise, and I don't remember if there's anybody else, was that a lot of the most exciting presentations that were actually not about the drugs, but about big data. And I don't think you can get to talking about big data if you don't have a solution for what big data teaches you. So you start to see tentacles that spring off the platform you're talking about. One is paying more attention to big data, right?
Yeah, and I think you see that sort of, the tentacles is a great metaphor for that. You see that begin to kind of reach out. That we've got, a couple of substantive medications that seem like they're doing good, big things. And then out of that, you're able to kind of collate this data from these things and what do you do with it? And as I said, for years now, there's been buzz about AI and machine learning. And I feel like a lot of that conversation has been ill-defined, and it's kind of also represented the larger conversation of which is, just so all over the place about AI. But now is a place when we're beginning to have these big data sets where and companies are beginning to go, oh, okay, this is what that means. This is how we can do it. We can take these huge data sets and begin to not just analyze and not just be kind of like the philosophy student looking for meaning, but actually take something from it and use it for a deliverable and outcome that helps improve patients' lives in some ways.
Yeah. So it's interesting, not only the companies, but the health systems, because some of the talk that we had about big data was not just about what would it do in the context of medication. But if you take the data that exists in electronic medical records and you link that with repeat FIB4s, you can do a much better job of figuring out who's in trouble than you can with a single FIB4 or repeat FIB4s or far more expensive tests. That it becomes an inexpensive way to sort all that stuff out.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that also kind of expands to the other diagnostics. I'm sure that we could probably do a similar sort of thing with FibroScan as well to kind of see, who, what, where, when, and why on a larger set. And if we had the means to be able to do that nationally, internationally, regional sort of thing as well. And when we look at the big companies, your LabCorps and your Quest or your diagnostic companies, I think there's a real opportunity now to start tying that together with medication to hopefully deliver it. And at the very least, be able to tie it together to more sort of focused screening endeavors that we have as well.
Yeah, good point. So anything else that you took out of Milan, if the headline, if we think about this like a newspaper, right? So the headline is broader, stronger platform of multiple mode of action drugs. Then what's the second story?
I don't want to be too much of people know what a broken record is anymore, is a defragged MP3 file.
Yeah, there you go.
Don't be too redundant.
Well, I just realized I said newspaper, and you know that we're both over a certain age because we both know what the heck I'm talking about when I say second lead. Go ahead.
So to not be too redundant, I do think there is this sense of optimism, and I don't want to downplay that. And it comes from multiple sources because we'll see that there are challenges here, there are challenges there. But even in the nature of our challenges, I feel like we have evolved into another level. It's like we've gone out. I don't know that we're out of the minors into the majors yet, but that we are definitely taking next steps for kind of greater challenges and stuff. We're engaging fibrosis in a way that I think, we've really struggled to kind of wrap our heads around, or for the field to wrap around how to best attack fatty liver disease. Also, to give credit, if you will, to the nomenclature change, moving away from non-alcoholic to metabolic, that it is holding the promise of showing now that we're having better and more conversations with the diabetes community, with, I think, frankly, the kidney community, with taking a look at the metabolic sort of aspect of this more so. And so I think there is that kind of undercurrent of the medication and the big data, but I also think that we're beginning to have more expanded and, dare I say, enlightened conversations in taking a look at what I would call the whole patient, but I think our clinician friends would call simply the metabolic state.
Hey, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And not necessarily the way I had thought about it, so thank you. I take that as a gift. Second, what's interesting is that the other patient advocates that I've asked about the meeting have all talked about things having to do more directly with patient advocacy, whereas you've gone to patient benefit, if you will, but not in an advocate's way per se. Not here's what we do as advocates, here's where we're stronger. It's just here are the things that are happening that are going to help us.
Well, I'll be a bit of a homer here and say that I think it's just that GLI has a little bit of a different approach. I mean, yeah, we are patient advocates. It's the heart of what we do in this, but we're very focused on the outcome and the deliverable on this. And so we're very concerned about medication approval, for, if you will, which means we're very concerned about clinical trials. But to have that conversation without talking about patient access is artificial. And so for us, we're feeling, that we're having, as I said earlier, elevated conversations, that we're feeling empowered and able to have these conversations at higher levels with more diverse voices, with a larger range of stakeholders, actually move the needle here on this. I think that's a difference. There's kind of a talking about the thing, and then there's a talking about the doing of the thing. And that's not to have any criticism against my fellow patient advocates in such a way, but I think our perspective is really geared at getting people into screening, making sure that things are done from point A to point B in the drug approval process. We go into protocol review advisory boards already thinking about patient access down the road. And I think the FDA's recent statements and guidelines on on diversity should reflect that. That shouldn't be just a clinical trial thing. That should be something that impacts patient access to medications down the road if it's done correctly. And so we're excited about that.
If the most important question for patients are, what can I do to help myself? Then that really has two issues in it, or what can the healthcare industry do to help me while I'm trying to help myself? And that really has two pull-throughs, right? One is what options are available, and second is what do I have to do to access them? So we've talked about the increased options. Do we have any insight on how this affects access or discussions about access?
I think I don't mean to go too meta on you, Roger, but I think the question is the answer there. That it's kind of, the obstacle is the path, if you will, because we've seen with Resmetirom, we needed a medication out of the gate. We needed something to get out there so we can now identify what are the issues we're going to have to go through. We can now run the traps actually instead of just theorizing about the traps. And this is helpful. I mean, we saw what happened with the Veterans Administration, with the VA, when they came out, and we've seen what we feared and has happened a little bit of the trickle down of the VA recommends biopsy for the diagnosis. That's a problem because suddenly we start getting a backlog of patients who have been prescribed the medication but don't have access to medication. And so that is the answer. Is the question you're asking is that, okay, now we get to ask different questions. Now we start to stress test this stuff and see where the mechanisms are that we need to influence on this.
Does the presence of more options have any impact on that?
Yeah, I think so. There's a little bit of a catch-22 in that, in as much that in the example of the VA, we don't want that. It has been, but we don't want that to be too precedent-setting. And so this isn't just us getting out there and fighting for Resmetirom to not have biopsy, but by the VA doing this, it kind of creates this loophole, if you will, where private insurers now can require biopsy or recommend biopsy. And so when we get, if Novo comes through next time, if survodutide comes next time, we were close to having this issue of biopsy kind of stamped out in terms of patient access. And so having more options it's important because it sets a precedent, but it also kind of gathers the troops, if you will, to have a bigger lever to push against this need for biopsy.
And now, back to Roger.
We hope you've enjoyed this recording. If you have any questions or comments about the content of this conversation or the entire episode, please put them in the review section of the page from which you downloaded this conversation, or send an email to questions@surfingmash.com. Also, remember to answer our questions of the week so that you can have a chance to hear panelists discuss them and be part of that discussion and recognized on the program. In our next episode, Maru Ranella joins Jorn, Louise, and me to discuss the recent expert recommendations on resmetirom paper published in CGH. Until then, stay safe, surf on. We'll see you on the podcast. Bye-bye now.